Ready?
Yeah.
Okay. How long before a meal is ideal for hunger to start to come up?
Yeah, it's a good question, but I suppose it's fairly relative. So I'll just tell you what I do with my clients because you might prefer to do something slightly differently if you eat 2 meals a day, for example. But what works really well with my clients is a 3-meal and 1 snack structure. And you're looking at maybe ideally then, they don't really get hungry until maybe, let's say, 4 hours between breakfast and lunch. So let's say they have breakfast 8 a.m. and then lunch is more like 12 to 1. And then slightly longer, most people conventionally like slightly longer, don't they, between lunch and dinner, I would say. So that's maybe 5 to 6 hours. And I think if you're getting hungry within, let's say, 60% of that time, so if you have breakfast at 8 a.m. and you start getting hungry at 10:30, as opposed to not until maybe just before 12, in my mind, that's a bit of a red flag, and that's an alarm bell, and that's a suggestion that maybe you're not calorically satisfied, maybe the balance of macronutrients wasn't quite right, so on and so forth. So yeah, I think, there's no set rule because it depends on how you like to eat, but that seems to be what works well for my clients and how it sort of plays out for my clients. Next.
What do you drink at AM? Coffee? Any alternatives?
What do I drink in the AM, I presume? Yeah, in the morning. I'm not a coffee guy. I joked about this on Instagram the other day. And I actually got loads of DMs about this. A lot of people agreeing with me. I thought I was the only one. I thought I was the only person, in Europe anyway, that doesn't like coffee. I know coffee's big elsewhere, but really big in Europe. And I always joke I'm the only British man that doesn't like tea as well. So yeah, I'm not a big tea fan. So for me, it's actually just H2O. It's just good old aqua, good old water, and that's it. And I thought it was just me, but I actually got a bunch of DMs when I talked about this on Instagram. So apparently it's just me. I'm not a big George behind the camera. He's a bit of a coffee addict, this guy. We're trying to wean him off it. We'll get him off it. He's doing well. Like, he's cleaned up his diet a lot recently. So yeah, coffee, the next step for George. But no, personally, I'm actually not a big fan. I just drink water pretty much.
What are the carb sources you normally eat?
What have I been having lately? Potatoes, big one. Been getting back into potatoes again. You guys see my cereal bowls, so that's usually muesli and bran flakes. Rice has been a staple for me for years and years beyond being vegan. I was a big rice person, whether it was the chicken, rice and broccoli, and now it's basically beans, rice and vegetables. So rice has been a staple for a long time. And bread, as long as it's a good quality bread, high in fiber, doesn't contain much white flour, none of those extra additives, nasties, not too much oil thrown in. I think the bread is a really good carb source, surprisingly. I think it's really, really brilliant for you and can be very weight loss compliant if you select the right bread and use it in the right quantities. So I think that's mainly it. I used to sort of have a bit more variety, I would say, with the grains, but to be honest with you, I'm pretty much all in with the brown rice at the moment.
Does oat milk really spike blood sugar?
Yeah, so this is, again, spoke about this on Instagram recently. All of these questions, I should mention, are from recent Q&As on Instagram, so we're just covering them again here. And then I think George has got some extra questions for me at the end. Yeah, I think what people need to understand about this question is that a food spiking blood sugar is not automatically a bad thing. I think there's some binary thinking around this. That when people hear that food spikes blood sugar or is high in carbohydrate, so therefore it spikes blood sugar, especially if it's primarily simple carbohydrate, I think people automatically take that as a sign that that food is unhealthy because it spikes blood sugar. It lacks nuance, to be honest. It's far more complex than that. If you're a healthy person and your body manages insulin correctly like it's supposed to, it matters not one iota if a food spikes blood sugar. In fact, it's a totally normal thing. It does not mean that you should avoid or omit that food. Rather, you should work on insulin resistance and insulin management. So you have, healthy control over that, and therefore your body can manage. This is what insulin does. It's there to manage blood sugar spikes accordingly. So no, it's not automatically a bad thing if oat milk, for example, causes blood sugar spikes. What is a bad thing is if you are diabetic or pre-diabetic because you've had a high-fat diet. That's the irony. It's not even caused by high carbohydrate intake, but because you've had a high-fat diet, for a long period of time, you're therefore diabetic, pre-diabetic, and therefore you can't manage the blood sugar spikes from carbohydrate-rich foods. That's the problem. So I forget the phraseology of the question. What was the exact question again, mate? Can you read it out again? Thank you.
Question was, does oat milk really spike blood sugar?
Yeah, so to be fair, I'm just answering the question. Yes, it does, but I'm adding the caveat of that's not automatically a thing to be feared. So go and do some more research on this. I've covered this in recent YouTube videos, but you want to be looking at the guys over at Mastering Diabetes. They're doing incredible work, to be honest, so shout out to them. Neil Bernard from PTRM, they cover this pretty extensively as well. A food causing blood sugar spike is not automatically a red flag.
Why did you go vegan?
How do I sum this one up without telling the whole story and eating up 5 minutes in this Q&A? Because I've covered it before, to be fair. I think the easiest way I can sum it up, let me think about this for a second. We're not cutting George, we're carrying on. The people are going to see how thoughtful I am with my answers here. I think it was when I became aware of the consequences of my behavior and my actions, and it built to an extent to whereby it was no longer enough that I could justify eating animal products. So you have awareness, you learn awareness of what's happening with the animal agriculture stuff, and then perhaps on the health side of things, you see the argument that too much meat, too many animal products can be very, very harmful. And I think when that awareness got to a tipping point to whereby I could no longer really sit there and have peace of mind as I was eating a bacon sandwich, or as I was eating more for me back then, you know, the 3 chicken breasts a day I was eating back then and the whey protein shakes, no longer could I basically have peace of mind. I felt guilty. It was where the guilt got to high enough that it was easier for me to actually take away the action that was causing the guilt rather than continue doing the action and feeling that terrible guilt. So for me, it was just getting to that tipping point. And initially I was drawn to, you know, a more plant-based way of eating for health reasons, as I've talked about before. But to this day, what keeps me this way is definitely the ethical side of things, for sure. So I later made that connection, and then I was like, okay, everything needs to go. Because I just got rid of meat first, to be fair. And then about a week later, I started learning about what was happening with dairy, and particularly what would happen with eggs and the little male baby chicks. And I was like, okay, I can't do this anymore. So that's when the ethical side really for me was like, oh, okay. That was when I had that epiphany. But yeah, good question.
Next is, what fat percentage in your diet do you typically recommend? Yeah,
I don't know if this is about me, because it says in your diet, doesn't it? Or I don't know if it's what do I recommend for others. I'm not sure. Because it says your as opposed to like me for the person asking or a person. Because it's relative to a degree, but 15% seems to be a good rule of thumb. I have made my arguments against consuming less than 10% of calories from fat, as is sort of advertised or advocated, let's say in the 80-10-10 approach that's sort of early vegan YouTube, was very popular on early vegan YouTube. Maybe a more sort of McDougallized or starch solution approach also advises around, or perhaps even arguably less than 10% of calories from fat. I think that is too low. I think you're missing out on some of the important benefits hormonally from fat intake, and the likes of nutrients, so omega-3s, that unless you're supplementing DHA, you're not taking care of that easily without those fat-rich plant foods in your diet to some degree. So I think 15% is about right, and you're not at risk of going too high. That's still a low-fat diet, but not a ridiculously low-fat diet. The best of both worlds, let's say.
Is tinned fruit okay if I wash the syrup?
Yeah, of course it is. Of course tinned fruit's okay, same as tinned beans. It's all very similar. I mean, yes, there's syrup on there. Yes, sometimes that syrup contains additives and extra sugar. Is that ideal? I mean, it depends what you mean by ideal. Is it optimal? No, not really. But you're only going to be having tinned fruit as a backup plan anyway. It's also quite cheap, actually, to be fair, it must be said. But if we're going to assume that fresh fruit is the go-to, and it's occasionally that you're having dried fruit, even if you have the syrup, it's not going to kill you. It's actually not the worst thing in the world. I try not to make this stuff so Puritan that you have to, think about this stuff, and you avoid tinned or canned goods as a result of this. So I think it's okay, and it gets a green light from me, but of course always worth stressing that fresh is best.
How to portion control?
How to portion control? This is obvious. Don't make more than you eat, or don't make more than you should eat, rather. I think we all know when we're overeating. I've made videos on telltale signs, and some people don't, but I would say that in terms of where my viewers are at, most of you guys have enough self-awareness and mindfulness. I talk to you on a pretty much daily basis. Most of you I know have enough mindfulness to know when you're overeating. You know when you've eaten too much. There are feelings of guilt there. And then in terms of very physical feelings, the hot flushes. If you have to remove clothes, that's maybe a sign that you're overeating. If you look down into your bowl or onto your plate and you realize you've only got a couple of spoonfuls left, that's a sign that you might have been eating too quickly because you're not paying so much attention and it's very sort of mindless and emotional. So there are telltale signs, and I think put these telltale signs to one side. I think you know if you're eating too much. Your body has mechanisms, the ghrelin and leptin, the way the hunger hormones work. You do intuitively know when you're overdoing it a lot of the time. There are exceptions to this, but generally. So I think don't make more than you know you should is step number one. This is particularly hard if you're a batch cooker, right? Because you might be thinking, I want to plan ahead. And then if you've got 3 meals worth of the stew or the casserole or the bean chili that you've made, it could be hard then to not justify going back. But try, if you are just making one meal at a time, try not to make more than you know you should eat. So that's step number one. Secondly, make sure you're living a relatively, cheese, isn't it? It's so cliche. Watch George's face change behind the camera as he starts laughing at me here. But when you're pretty happy and fulfilled, and when you feel like you're spending your time fairly well, even if you're not perfect all the time, because life isn't always easy, you aren't really looking for things outside of yourself as much. And so for me, the times in my life when I was overeating, when I was emotionally eating, so when I wasn't happy with how I was spending my time, I think particularly back to my student years. That's when I turned to food. So how do you portion control? You make sure that the rest of the areas of your life, one way or another, spit it out right, are in check. And that's going to make you less likely to go back for more and see food as an answer to emotional problems. Sorry, George, I keep moving. George is like, stop moving out of focus behind the camera. Are we good? Are we okay?
Yeah, we're good.
So I think that's it. I don't want to spend too long on it, but hopefully that's helpful.
Been travelling for 2 weeks, so eating out a lot. Great vegan options, but the oil and salt, how to avoid?
You can't really, and like a little bit of salt I'm fine with anyway, so it's only oil for me that's a major red flag here. I mean, you could always ask the servers, to be fair, you could always ask the staff and you could say, look, can you do this without oil? And if they're half accommodating, depending on where you are in the world, they probably will. They probably will be okay with that, and they probably will be able to accommodate you on that. So it's always worth asking. But you also don't need to. Like, you're traveling, you're away. Like, if there's a little bit of, let's hope it's olive oil, for example, but if there's a little bit of oil on your food, it really, I don't think, is the worst thing in the world that you occasionally do that. As much as I'm staunch on the oil thing, we're not talking about every day for the rest of your life. And I don't want you to get in the habit of making allowances with the oil. But, let's assume this is just a trip and this isn't how you're going to spend your day-to-day life. If there's a little bit of oil on your otherwise pretty clean plate of food when you go out to eat, I really don't actually think that's the worst thing in the world.
Is there such a thing as a slow metabolism?
I don't know if slow is the right word. That's maybe a bit of a bro science or like pseudoscience word, but there's definitely such a thing as a less efficient metabolism. I think one of the big misunderstandings in the mainstream health and weight loss world is that metabolism is fixed and that it's set and it doesn't change, and therefore you can very accurately and precisely predict how many calories to feed someone, and therefore what will happen to their body weight and body composition as a result of feeding X amount of calories to said person. This is all predicated on the idea that you can actually predict that, which is all predicated, again, the next step, by extension, on the idea that the metabolism is fixed and you can accurately predict that. Metabolism moves, it's more like a sliding scale rather than set, and I think that's a really important thing to understand. So, is it true that you can is there such a thing as a slow metabolism? There's such a thing as a efficient or inefficient metabolism, or let's say more efficient and less efficient metabolism, and it is something that moves, and by managing various lifestyle factors from nutrition to sleep to hydration to stress management, hormonal function, you can ensure that your metabolism is as efficient as it can be, and therefore you can consume as many possible calories for weight loss.
Food that can accelerate metabolism.
All the metabolism questions here, right? No, they're good. Metabolism is really something that's probably a fairly neglected topic when it comes to health and weight loss. So I'm glad they're here. I'm glad they're being included. I'm glad to see you guys are thinking about these things. This diet is amazing anyway. This diet is amazing, metabolically for so many reasons. But you can check out foods that have a particularly high thermic effect. I mean, many plant foods do have a really high thermic effect. By this idea of thermogenics or thermic effect, if you're not familiar, basically a food with a high thermic effect requires a lot of energy to digest comparatively versus other foods. And so plant foods have a really high thermic effect anyway by default usually because they're extremely high in fiber. And fibrous foods have a really high thermic effect. They require a lot of energy to digest. Fiber draws a lot of water to your digestive system. It's a lot of work to break down, as it should be, because we're designed to have very high fiber diets. We don't nowadays, but we're designed to. And so fiber has a very high thermic effect. Foods actually that are high in protein have a very high thermic effect as well, which the really sort of anti-protein vegans will not want to hear, but it's true. So foods that are high in protein have quite a high thermic effect. But you can just Google this. There's things like chili peppers, because they contain capsicum, have a really high thermic effect. Mushrooms, ginger, mustard seeds. So there are foods that have a very, very high thermic effect anyway, but to be honest, I think this is really advanced and it's kind of minutiae. Generally, eat a fairly well-balanced, diverse plant-based diet, and you'll be capitalizing on the thermic effect of plant foods easily anyway.
Okay, so we got my questions now.
Okay, so that's everyone's questions done from Instagram, but I think George has got a couple more, so fire away, my man, hit me. Are they tough? I want them to be difficult, my friend, so make them hard.
Alright, I'll let you finish your water first. Oh, that was good. So what's the hardest part of losing weight?
It's definitely the behavioural component, isn't it? I think I think, to put it concisely, it's really buying into the idea that you can be a different person than you are now. Because right now we have insecurities and self-narratives about how we're the person that loves chocolate, we can't live without wine night, we'll always pick last in sports class. I know these are really cliche things, but these are things that my clients tell me all the time that they're stuck with, or stories that they've been stuck with from the past. And so it's being able to draw a line and a boundary between that story of your current self and the story that you could potentially be a new person, a person that does genuinely see themselves as healthy and fit. And then by extension, having that not only as your personal identity, but other people feeding that back to you. And other people saying, referring to you as the person that takes care of their health, the person that's in great shape, the person that's slim. And so I think it's really about believing the idea that this is actually possible, which is easier said than done when you have a past of really struggling with weight loss and with nutrition and feeling powerless to food. Of course you're not going to believe that you can do this. Of course you're not really deep down necessarily going to believe that you could be a slim person. But you have to see there's a light at the end of the tunnel, and you have to leave all that old stuff in the past. So basically not being tarred by your past. I suppose that's a bit of a cheesy sort of like new age self-help answer, but that's my honest answer to the question. I think that's really important.
Okay, the next thing, obviously I've gone vegan recently. Is there anything I need to look out for?
Yeah, so George has gone vegan recently. We have chatted about this, but it's good that we included this question anyway for anyone that's just transitioned. I can't remember what we chatted about when we had that first conversation in the cafe about it, mate, but we definitely talked about, you definitely asked me about supplements and vitamins and minerals, so we'll probably start there. I don't know that this is actually the thing that first needs focus when you go vegan. I actually think there's other things that maybe need your attention first, just finding a simple meal plan that you actually enjoy and having easy, quick options for your schedule and not getting overwhelmed. I think that's probably step number one. I think things like supplements, they are important, so I don't want to downplay them or sound like I'm disregarding or brushing them under the carpet, but I think in terms of your priority list, get your meal plan down first. But we'll start with supplements because that is something we spoke about, and I think we're looking at vitamin D, we're looking at B12, and we're looking at DHA or omega-3 as being your 3 mandatory supplements when you go vegan. For the record, I argue that meat eaters should certainly be supplementing vitamin D, arguably B12, less so omega-3, but that's just for the record. So these are not vegan-only supplements, but these are things I stress are mandatory when you transition. So that's that out of the way. And then aside from that, like I said earlier, just find a simple meal plan. You only need 4 or 5 meals. I think some people, they go out and they get really excited, which is cool. They get really enthusiastic. They jump on YouTube and they find these really elaborate recipes, or they go and get, vegan cookbooks and whatnot. And that's cool. Especially if someone else is cooking for you, George? That's cool when someone makes a little personal joke there, folks. When someone makes stuff for you that you don't have to worry about yourself, that's really helpful. But I think people are at risk of making this way too complex and elaborate for their own practicality and adherence. So keep it simple. Just pick 4 or 5 main meals that you're going to focus on for the next week or 2, and just rotate between those. And don't overcomplicate it.
And the last is, you and I have travelled a little bit recently.
Yeah.
And you're kind of always travelling, so it's like the first time we've been able to record in a while.
Yeah.
How do you stay on track while away from home?
Yeah, it's a good question. I find it very easy to be vegan away from home, depending on where you go. I went on a skiing trip to France once, and that was difficult. But I survived, and it was okay. It wasn't ideal, but it was okay. But most of the time, it's worth stressing, I never really struggle with the vegan thing, wherever I am in the world, pretty much. That said, I wouldn't choose to go to somewhere there was clearly very little in the way of vegan options. But I don't think I'd plan to go to Argentina. I'm sure I could make it work, but with what I hear about how into their red meats they are there, it probably isn't an obvious location for a vegan to go. But I never really struggle with that. I suppose being a health-conscious vegan when you're traveling is harder. And I suppose we covered it in the previous video, the previous question, a couple of questions back that someone asked. There's a bit of overlap there with the traveling question, but I think try and find stuff on the menu that's clearly high in fiber. So get lots of veggies on the plate if you can find beans, etc., whole grains, just fibrous stuff. And if there's a bit of oil, if there's a bit of processed stuff that you wouldn't usually have, if there's the occasional vegan burger, don't sweat it because you have to make this stuff stick. And if you grill yourself for decisions you make on the road, and then you take that back home with you after that trip or after that vacation holiday, it's going to be hard because you're going to be sat there with the burden and the guilt of, I really screwed this up, I messed this up. And for a lot of people, that can sort of open the floodgates and that sort of proverbial slippery slope ensues. So it's very important that you don't see small wobbles and small deviations in your diet as a failure, as the, I'm messing this up, I'm never going to be able to make this work. You're on holiday, for goodness sakes. Like, what do you expect? Like, go out, enjoy yourself. Like you've been with me, George, when we've had cocktails, and I'm very transparent about like the booze thing. Like I don't drink often, and when I do drink, I don't do any of this binge drinking nonsense like I used to partake in my student days. Bloody hell! But like I will have the occasional G&T, I will have the occasional glass of whiskey, but it's very, very inoften. And when I do, it's very, very inoften. I almost said often there. And when I do have those things, it's not like the slippery slope ensues now, because I've been doing this long enough, I've got enough trust and confidence in myself, and I've got enough sort of established, implemented habits to whereby I have it, and I'm like, nah, take me back to the juice or the smoothie or the water, I'm fine with that. And so if I have, a vegan burger, I don't sit there and think, oh, now I need vegan ice cream after it. I don't really do that. I'm kind of like, my next meal I want to have some fruit, or I just want to go back to my diet. That happens with experience, to be fair, but that's what I would say is like, don't sweat if you go away on vacation, and don't dramatize one little deviation as, I'm failing, I'm really screwing this up, because you're not. You're just on vacation. It's not indicative of how a whole month or a whole year in your life is going to go. So don't sweat it. Just do the best you can. Lots of fiber on the plate. And, if you know you're going to be going out to eat, it's okay to have a smaller breakfast, that day, to give you a bit of, calorie leeway. I never think you should compensate the next day. So one bad habit dieters get into is if they mess up their diet or if they have a cheat day, then they only eat 1,000 calories the next day. I think that is ridiculous. I think that's very dangerous territory indeed, mentally. But I do agree with compensation day to day. So if you know you're going to be eating out in the evening and there's a likelihood that you'll have something that's a bit more calorific than on your typical plan, then yeah, fine, go ahead and maybe have a slightly smaller breakfast than you ordinarily would in terms of calorie amounts to create that leeway. Does that make sense? Yeah. I think without spieling on too much, because it's probably a long video now, I think that's it, mate. Are we there?
Yeah, we are just under 25 minutes.
Cool.
So.
See you soon, folks. Thanks.